One of the deadliest, if not the deadliest plague to ever sweep across the world was the Black Death, that hit in the 14th century. It's been estimated that between 75 to 200 million people were killed in this, and it would peak in Europe between 1347 and 1351. The plague for people was a great shock, and many believed that it was sent by God to punish the people on earth for their sins, but the treatments of it at the time were rather bizarre, and no one knew how to deal with it. It's believed in Europe to have wiped out between 30 to 60% of the entire population, showing how brutal and ruthless it was, but as mentioned, many treatments and preventions were useless. People believed in the idea of transference, and they would strap animals to themselves in the hope that the Black Death would leave them. However, this was of no use. But one shocking way that people tried to cure the Black Death, and to prevent it, was to persecute a specific type of people, and this resulted in the widespread executions all across Europe. Join us today as we look at the horrific executions of the Black Death, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The horror of living through the Black Death was awful, as each day dozens of people were dying, and someone would have believed that they would be next. One account from the time in Italy states, father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best as they could, without priests, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I buried my 5 children with my own hands, and there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all waited death, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Because of the lack of medical knowledge, the treatments and cures were mostly useless, and they would result in little progress. But one people who were falsely blamed for the outbreak of the Black Death across Europe was Jews. There were many violent acts carried out in many different European cities against these people, and it led to a huge migration of Jews to other areas. But this was not the first time that anti-Semitic violence had erupted in Europe, as Jews were often used as scapegoats and they were falsely accused of causing the disease, and people claimed they did this by poisoning wells. Often in certain places they were less affected than others, as they chose not to drink from the common wells, which would spread disease across towns and cities. There were accounts of Jews being tortured to confess that they had done this, and that they had been coerced into admitting that they caused outbreaks of the disease, but things got much worse as massacre occurred. The first massacre relating to the plague took place in April 1348 in Toulon, and the Jewish area of the town was raided and homes were looted, and 40 people were murdered inside of their homes. Following this, violence then erupted in Spain and in Barcelona, but in 1349 the massacres spread all across Europe. There were horrific scenes played out in Zurich, Basel, Aragon and Flanders, and on the 14th of February 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the Valentine's Day Strasbourg massacre. But strangely, the plague had not yet hit this city. As the people burned, the Christians in the city searched through the valuable possessions that were not burnt and looted them. But then in September of that year, 330 Jews were burned alive east of Zurich inside of a castle, and at this time there were many Jewish communities which were being destroyed and were being literally razed to the ground. Some would even take their own lives, such was the persecution, but in 1349 also the Jewish community in Frankfurt and Mainz was wiped out. The emperor had to begin with introduced a huge tax on the Jews, and they were then held responsible for the Black Death, and the emperor would propagate these falsities, and because of this there were huge riots and violent beatings. All of the Jews of Frankfurt were beaten to death, or their homes were set on fire, and these murders were encouraged by virulent members of the church, who were spreading these rumours and encouraging it. Further attacks occurred in Mainz and Cologne, with the 3,000 Jews of Mainz trying to defend themselves from the Christians, but this would be in vain, as they were then overwhelmed, and they were all then slaughtered. In Speyer, the corpses of those killed were thrown into wine barrels, and these were then thrown into the River Rhine. But the massacres were horrific, and the hundreds of incidents across Europe of this sort of behaviour carried on. But the link between the Jews and the causes were wide, and some claimed that they were the enemies of Christ. But the local governments of areas, and even kings and emperors at times, would refuse to protect these communities, and they would also encourage the behaviour of those who were rioting and attacking. This led to Jews moving to the east, but King Casimir III of Poland would give refuge to them, and for 6 centuries they would remain until the outbreak of the Second World War, when Hitler would launch the Holocaust in Poland following the invasion. Casimir would ban the kidnapping of Jewish children to convert them to Christianity, and he would also order executions for those who were seen destroying Jewish cemeteries and damaging homes. Pope Clement VI tried to protect the Jews by issuing papal orders, and he said that those who blamed them for the Black Death had been seduced by the devil, and he said, "It cannot be said that the Jews by such a heinous crime are the cause or occasion of the plague, because through many parts of the world the same plague, by the hidden judgment of God, has afflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves, and many other races who have never lived alongside them." He tried to urge members of the Catholic Church to shelter and protect them when they could, but his work would be ruined by Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, who would turn a blind eye to the attacks, and his influence with this matter was rather limited. But as the Black Death seemed to come to an end and wane in around 1350 in Europe, the violence against the Jews stopped significantly. The violent persecution would be over slightly in 1351, but there were still elements of society that would look upon them differently. Massacres would carry out decades later in certain cities such as Brussels, but for different reasons, and this would end the Jewish settlement in some areas. But some of the biggest impacts of the persecution was, as mentioned, the migration of Jews to Poland. As the centuries rolled on, the Jewish population would grow to the number of 3.5 million when Hitler would rise to power. But the Jews would tell stories of the horrors they experienced for centuries after the Black Death, with these stories being passed down from generation to generation. The executions of the Black Death were horrific, and many blamed the Jews for causing the pestilence that caused so much devastation. We now know what caused the horrific disease outbreak, but at the time people would look for any reason to persecute and blame others. It was a period of history where Jews suffered much anti-Semitism across Europe, and they were blamed for the deadly disease, and this resulted in horrific deaths, with many being executed by being burned alive or by being beaten to death inside of towns and cities. It was a troubling time for Europe, and after the dust had settled on the plague years, Europe struggled to get to grips with what truly happened. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.